Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Breach Response, the Benefits of Data Privacy Tools to Support Breach Readiness. Big data breaches are unfortunately all too common, so we have a great presentation lined up for today, which addresses strategies and best practices for data breach readiness and remediation. So before we begin, I want to go over some housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded. The recording will be shared with participants within 48 hours. Please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box anytime. We will answer as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. Any questions we do not get time to answer today will be replied to via email. And that's it. Now I'm going to turn it over to our three presenters to introduce themselves. Dean?
Great. Thanks, Neve. I really appreciate it. Welcome, everybody, today. This is a really exciting discussion and a bit of an encore presentation. Josh, Joe, and I did this at the MER event and then did a shorter version at the SEGO event a few months ago, and it was pretty well received. And we wanted to share some of the takeaways and real-world results with you guys today. From a disclaimer perspective, please keep in mind that we're rendering our own individual opinions and not those of our respective entities. And we'll get to who we are here immediately. So I'm Dean Gonsowski. I'm your trusty moderator today. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at Active Navigation. I've been at Active Nav about a year and have been in the e-discovery and information governance space for about 20 years. Former practicing attorney by trade, but have been working with software companies in particular for the last decade or so. And you'll hear a tiny bit about Active Navigation throughout, but not too much in particular. And for folks who don't know, Active Navigation is an enterprise software company, and we provide data discovery, minimization, and classification tools, like the one that is subject to the use case we're going to cover in a moment. And with me, we've got Josh Rattan and Joe Ponder. So Josh, you want to lead off next and talk a little bit about your background?
Sure thing, Dean. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Josh Rattan. I'm a partner with PwC. I help to lead our information governance and information management practice. Our practice is a full service consultancy, meaning we help our clients define, execute, and implement information governance programs and related technologies. I have a background in cybersecurity, identity and access management in particular, and I'd say over the last 12 to 13 years have been kind of bridging the gap between cybersecurity, information management, and information governance. I've had the pleasure of teaming with Dean, the Active Navigation crew, and Joe on a number of projects, and really look forward to talking through our experiences and the topic at hand today. So thank you. Joe?
Cool. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
My name is Joe Ponder, owner of InfoCycle. InfoCycle is a boutique consulting firm based in Nashville, focused on information governance. And so we help clients with really three main goals. How do we improve the data integrity, improve overall data security, and improve data utilization, all while lowering the cost of data management. And so as Dean and Josh have indicated, we've been able to work together on a number of different initiatives, and excited to share some of that story with you today.
Great. Well, thanks, guys. Let's talk about our agenda quickly. So we're going to cover sort of at a high level the data breach landscape. Most of this will become is probably motherhood and apple pie to most, but we'll hit a few high points there, and then we'll really jump into the meat of the presentation and talk about a real world data breach and remediation effort thereafter, and some of the technologies and outcomes that that came out of that. And then, helping, obviously in a data breach, you're on the back foot, you're, as the Brits would say, you're reactive, and that's not a spot anybody wants to be in. And so we'll talk about how to become a bit more proactive in preparing for these kind of scenarios. And we'll then wrap up with some key takeaways and some questions. So this is, I like this slide in that, we've now come to understand that, data breaches are not an if, but a when. And what I was going to say is you could read all the numbers. It's a good graph. Comes out from the Pony Institute. But the short answer is 0% probability of data breach isn't on here. And so the reality is you've got a probability of a data breach and not a possibility. And for most organizations, this is probably, you guys have, this is sunk in, but this is really, really critical. And you hear lots of stories about data security, InfoSec, and you talk about your home and protecting your jewels. There's lots of good examples around there. But think how differently you would act if you knew your home was going to get broken into. And not like once in your lifetime, but once every year or two, or a couple years. You'd probably take a very different approach, not only to security, but also to understanding what you have and how you protect it. And that's, I think, one of the key messages for today is we're going to talk about how do you live in a world where data breaches are a certainty. The next one here is that, we now see that certainly when you have the breaches, the costs are significant. Pony again does a good example of breaking out the costs, everything from hard cost to brand diminishment, a number of other things. They actually will get it down to sort of the $148 cost per record. But needless to say, the costs are going up. It's certainly harder to contain the data breaches, and we'll show the one slide next that talks about the length of these breaches before kind of moving into the meat of the discussion. But needless to say that they are expensive, they are significant, and we'll see some of the mean time of exposure here in a second. This one is, we call it hacker playtime. Ponymon actually has some pretty good acronyms on. There's MTTC, which is the mean time to contain the breach, and then there's the mean time to identify the breach. The long story short of it is that it's easy to think of a breach as sort of same as a burglary, where like somebody breaks in and then you find them and you fix it. I was really surprised when I first saw some of these statistics about how long these this mean time to identify takes. And so here you show that it's north of 250 days. It's getting longer. And certainly, when you're talking about months and quarters for a business, that's a really significant amount of time. And we'll talk in a second about what happens when the bad guys are inside your enterprise. They're not just necessarily looking for good stuff. They're looking for ways to further expand and manipulate the information they found and sort of broaden the surface area of their attack. And that's really the danger point. One thing I want to point out here was for folks who, like myself, are big SPG and now Marriott loyalty folks. They, when that Marriott breach came out, you thought, oh, that's surprising and bad. And do they have my passport number and a few other things I thought. But next is, when did it happen? And in reality, that the breach that was subject for the Marriott one, the big public one, actually happened when SPG was not a part of Marriott yet. And so it goes to show that these breaches can lie effectively dormant for months or quarters, certainly possibly years before they're detected, and the damage that can happen in that phase is certainly significant.
Well, and Dean, I would also add that the investment piece is an interesting. This is an interesting look at it as well, right? Because often companies spend a fair amount of their security and governance budgets around trying to protect the network and keep the bad guys out. When you combine this with the previous couple slides where we're talking about that they're going to get in, and yet the effort and the investment of time and money is so minimal on, once they get in, what are they going to get access to? And so I think it's really kind of an eye-opening chart from that perspective as well, just to make sure that people understand it's not just about keeping folks out, but also about, trying to manage the data better so that whenever they do get in, which we know they're going to, we've got a better feel for what might be accessible and what might not be.
And just building on that, building on that, I would say, as I'm sure the audience can appreciate, one of the questions that we commonly get is, how do we justify the investment necessary to tackle, say, what Joe's describing, getting a sense of the estate and understanding what's behind the firewall. And maybe fortunate or unfortunately, we now increasingly have a good sense of what the cost is not to take action, to not understand what the impact is. If you look at the Yahoo deal as an example, the impact to the valuation of the organization by virtue of the breach is a great indicator of the cost of not taking action or not having the right posture and unfortunately experiencing the breach. So these data points are increasingly out there. You rewind the clock 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and it would be maybe potentially much harder to have a number of examples where you'd be able to stand in front of your executive team or board and justify the expense. Today, you certainly have a plethora to lean on and to justify that business case.
Yeah, and also, we'll get into compliance or regulatory fines and the like. But to Josh's point, when you see BA get fined for their breach, I think it was 188 million pounds, which depending on the exchange rate is either 188 million dollars or slightly higher, depending on Brexit discussions of the day. But that's a lot of money, right? And that some of these other costs, brand diminishment and the like, are a bit softer, but large fines. And I think they also I saw this the other day, I think they just certified the class for that and allowed certain individual lawsuits to move forward. So when you start adding up fines and class action litigation and all the remediation, it becomes a pretty big number pretty quickly. All right, so now jumping into the meat of today's discussion. So for good or for ill, the team here on the phone and our respective companies and solutions and software all were brought to bear on one of the world's largest data breaches. And certainly there were a lot of angst and sleepless nights for all parties concerned. But now that the dust is settled, it's a nice time to sort of sit back and reflect a little bit about how the confluence events led to maybe the breach and some of the ramifications and the spread of the contagion thereafter. And then we'll kind of move into a little bit more of the remediation. So I'll let you guys kind of jump into here and start taking over.
Yeah. I think in the case of this breach, in this example, a couple of things jump out to me, Dean. I think the first is, the understanding that you've got to continually invest to progress your security posture and your information governance posture is very real. You don't really realize just how maybe big of a hole you have until you have to sort of respond your way out of that technical debt, so to speak. And one of the main factors, I think, this particular case where I highlighted was because of that technical debt and the size of the data estate. Not knowing the data estate or understanding it, created a kind of a multiplier effect in terms of response as well as cleanup. And so, being able to ask or answer the simple question of, all right, well, if this continues, what's our exposure? And B, how do we know that we can contain this and that this isn't an isolated issue, but something that could be more pervasive? In those two questions, because of a lack of understanding of the data estate and a lack of an ability to effectively know the assets out there to deploy tooling to build that data estate, they were unable to answer those questions. And I think that kind of creates the foundation or the backdrop in my mind for where this heads, right? And so, of course, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off, Josh. I was just going to kind of underpin that with, I think, the two areas that stick out for me, not just in this case, but across a number of different clients that I've worked on, is the lack of consistency and compliance with internal policy as it relates to two things: data classification and data retention. I think that's a pretty common challenge that most organizations face. Is most have policies that help delineate and distinguish different types of data, and most have a retention schedule published that helps them drive some type of classification and retention requirements. However, actual application of that typically falls short. So case in point, when the breach does happen, and you're stuck with years of data that according to your own policies should have been cleaned up, that's where the plot thickens a bit, right? So I think it underscores the importance of, as you're defining your policies for retention, for classification, you've really got to do it in a way that where you're thinking about these kinds of scenarios. How do you make it actionable in a way that promotes defensible disposition and proper data management, versus having it be more of a boilerplate document that exists just for the sheer sake of having something in place.
Yeah, and Jens, I've got to kind of follow up a couple of questions here that occurred to me. But if I recall, Josh, was this entity, and to the extent not need to get into any details, but I believe one of the, and when you bring in entities, you maybe if you're smaller, you understand all your data and all your systems, but if you acquire somebody, you inherit a bunch of information. I can't recall, but was that an element in this one as well?
Well, there was certainly an aspect of the organization that has grown through acquisition, and so that played into a bit of it. But I would say it was that plus the combination of a lack of centralized governance over two aspects. The one that Joe mentioned, which was, actual application enforcement of data classification and retention, combined with the fact that there was a lack of centralized governance and oversight, especially from a data risk or an information governance perspective, on IT asset management and application provisioning. Maybe put it in sort of real terms, the organization allowed itself to rapidly prototype and deliver solutions to clients that proliferated similar data sets throughout, and then would allow for new systems to sort of sprawl. So they were very responsive to their clients, et cetera, but that sprawl can create challenges in terms of oversight and governance. So
yeah,
it really kind of a combination. Now, I don't think this is a dissimilar story from probably what some or many of our attendees see in their organization, right? It's, governance of your data estate is really going to require a multifaceted approach, and top-down, sort of oversight and control is a critical element, in addition to understanding sort of the bottom-up view of where data assets are and how they're being used, et cetera.
And Josh, you've got a bullet here on dark data. And I think maybe the challenge for lots of companies is this falls into the unknown. Companies understand their structured data pretty well, but they just have no sense of what's out there lurking. And I know this was an issue here, but are you seeing this pretty pervasively?
Yeah, I would say it's interesting in how it manifests itself. But to your point, there's a core analytics environment or set of environments where the data is quote unquote well defined or described, and so general knowledge of what it is understood. But then sort of outside of that environment, the rest is poorly understood, and that could be a symptom of the issues I described before. It could be maybe data is being downloaded from that core analytics environment and being used throughout the enterprise. It could be a number of factors. The other pain point we see is a lack of understanding in terms of how the organization is sharing information with third parties. What does that surface area look like in terms of data that's being collected or created by an organization, and how are they transmitting, sharing, engaging with third parties, and what controls are they putting around the third party side of things? I think that third party aspect has to be filed under the unknowns, the dark data side of things, as much as the internal environment. And look, until you have visibility, in my opinion, on the data estate, it becomes very challenging to appropriately govern. How are you going to know what your policies really need to be, what your strategy really needs to be, unless you get even that high level picture of what data is out there, who owns it, what's it being used for, so on and so forth.
Yeah, thanks. And Joe, I think this is some of your content. You want to maybe walk through how you think about the process for starting to understand your data estate?
Yeah, sure. So, I think from an industry perspective, we used to talk about this more as a data mapping exercise, and I still think that's applicable. We've gotten away from that terminology a bit just because I feel like it's people look at the idea of a data map as kind of an overly burdensome and daunting task. But I think it's important that we remember that we don't have to go to the nth degree of detail in order to have a documented data estate. And so, as we looked at building this out, it's always important to focus on these high-level categories. Ownership of data and ownership of assets, trying to capture who's ultimately responsible for the asset and for the data ownership. A high-level understanding of applications and their associated dependencies. Some details around process and cross-dependencies between applications. And then finally, an understanding of data composition. So what types of information might be stored on that asset. And these are just kind of four categories that we recommend starting with, but by all means, scale it to what works best for you. But I think it's important when scoping something like this that you keep the scope tight and that it stays consistent with what your intent of using the data map really is, as well as what your mechanism for updating the data map is. Because like I said, I know all too often we kind of boil the ocean. We create this pristine map only to see it go by the wayside 12 months later and become obsolete. And so, a lot of the basic IT asset management solutions on the market capture these details, but 99% of the time, a lot of the fields are blank. right? Because the time isn't taken to understand the governance and the ownership structure of the assets that are being deployed to meet business needs. And so, you know, just a bit of investment in this space on the front end, I think, goes a long way, because it is a matter of, you know, whenever it's time to start talking about cleanup activities, which we'll get to shortly, if you don't have these basic building blocks in place, it's really cumbersome to structure any kind of a remediation workflow that's going to meet the business needs and really, you know, stand the test of having true defensible disposition of the data. I mean, if you don't know who owns it, how do you go about routing it and getting approvals prior to the data going away? And so there's a lot of benefit here, I think, for a little bit of effort on the front end. So definitely an area of focus for anybody looking to embark on a governance initiative.
Dean, if I could add, just building on Joe's points, if anybody on the call here is looking for a reason to or an external driver to build a data map or an information map, look no further than your favorite privacy legislation or some of your cybersecurity requirements out there, like PCI or regulations like DFS. You know, there definitely is a need for an organization to have an understanding of its estate, and certainly these requirements could be narrow, like for instance PCI and cardholder data, or they could be broad or more broad in terms of personal information and PII. So if building this understanding becomes a bit of an inhibitor, you know, you can certainly point to these increasingly more prevalent requirements from a regulatory legal perspective as the starting point. You know, the other thing I would put out there is kind of building on this. If there is initiatives like, you know, you have a reason to be PCI compliant, start with where you already are doing this within the organization and build on it. There's no reason to sort of start anew. See if there isn't a way to kind of start rolling the snowball, so to speak, you know, bigger, based on the work that's already being done. And Joe, I totally agree with Joe. You know, you want to make sure that you're thinking about the scope, so that while you're trying to create this complete picture, you're not creating an endless task, something that kind of, you know, falls apart on itself because it's too big of an ask.
Yeah, I like all that, Josh, and it does, you know, harken back to the my earlier e-discovery days, right, where you would do this kind of retroactively to figure out how you would manage a legal hold or a collection, which certainly I'm sure for most of you is still happening within in your organization. So you've got to understand some of this just to figure out how to go grab data for e-discovery purposes. We're also seeing more of gilding the lily a tiny bit here around data minimization as a concept, and how are you going to minimize what you don't understand. And so I think all of this is kind of moved from a reactive, we'll figure it out when we need it, to need to be much more proactive, not only for breach, but a bunch of other reasons. And that's why we're seeing the stakeholders who are interested in these kind of efforts increase dramatically. Well, let's jump into the actual the firefight where the rubber hits the road. And so by way of background, pretty quickly post breach, the client had a need to not only contain it and figure out what happened, but start to understand their exposure. And they used Discovery Center for certain portions of this analysis, and we were Discovery Center's active navigations file analysis solution. We were ultimately were deployed in 18 data centers, and I won't go through all the data here, but currently we're at about 5 petabytes of data indexed. And the key to all this is to not only to understand the data state, but then get down to some of these lower bullets, which is finding the sensitive data that was exposed, that shouldn't have been exposed, getting those ready for remediation, and then actually remediating those. And so maybe you guys, there's a lot in here in one slide, but maybe you guys could cover a few areas to highlight.
Yeah, sure. So, for me, the interesting pieces here aren't necessarily that we found 16 million plus sensitive data hits. I think, by the nature of some of the highly regulated industries that we work with and the types of data that they manage, we expected that to a large degree. I think what's more interesting is that there are a lot of commonalities among that data set when we look at it from different angles. So as we started looking at data, the age of some of this content, as we started looking at the way that it's stored throughout the company network, and the business continues to evolve, the industry continues to evolve around how files are stored and managed. And so, most companies out there will have, different storage platforms, some that are newer, some that are older, some that are on-prem, some that are cloud. And so I think, looking at it from those angles, from an age perspective or from a storage location perspective, helps quickly shine the light on the overall usability of the data, whether or not the business even needs the data or uses it for anything. We also looked at it from modification and access dates, and so access dates are a little bit more challenging at times because not every system reports them inappropriately. But when was the data last modified? Well, if it hasn't been modified in X number of years, is it truly active? Is it truly needed? And then obviously a lot of the textual analytics that we ran on this data told us whether or not the data was, if we could see the data, could see the sensitive information, then we knew it wasn't encrypted. And so a lot of this stuff wasn't encrypted from the start. And so I think, being able to take this, you're going to find sensitive data. It's just the nature of doing business and having to store the data throughout the company network. I think it's what's telling is to be able to slice and dice it in certain ways that allows the company to quickly action the content so that you can quickly delete it if it's out of compliance with retention or encrypt it, so that as long as it's going to stay around, at least it's protected at rest. I think was a big part of this story. And then to kind of jump on the comment I made earlier, you can't really dispose of any of this if you don't have the details worked out as far as who ultimately owns the data. You can, it's just not advisable. And so a lot of energy in this case was spent on kind of reverse engineering some of the process to understand who the ultimate owners of the data were prior to going through and disposing of the data that could be disposed of. Anything to add there, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I think more just building on your comments, what I felt was interesting was the picture that we were given at the beginning prior to deploying Discovery Center, painted a picture that was much different than, in my opinion, kind of what we started seeing at the grassroots level, the picture that was being painted by the actual tool and the data itself. Maybe said a bit differently, you are just getting anecdotes and knowledge that was as good as the tenure of the person you were talking to when you started out, and being able to start seeing the data in real time and understand what's really there, to your points, Joe, around, age, et cetera, type, location was kind of eye-opening to me. And I would also add and reinforce the point you made. I think in the context of deploying a tool like Discovery Center, the capabilities of the tool to surface and understand the data state are very real. The actioning piece is really the challenging part. And that's going to happen generally outside of the tool, where you're engaging with your stakeholders to drive consensus around what data should be restricted and access controlled versus deleted or quarantined and the like. And to Joe's point, if you're not able to bring the right stakeholders to the table, it becomes an uphill battle, not unsolvable, but an uphill battle to make action, to take action on this content. Now, in this case, the client had the benefit, although they probably wish they didn't, of a crisis to call everybody to the table to at least move some of these big issues to the side and kind of reach agreement more quickly. But setting that foundation of understanding ownership and what the operational process will be like once you've found potentially sensitive information is as critical to setting up the tool and running it from a success and outcomes perspective. So making sure that you have that foundational piece in place is very real.
Yeah, I like that, Josh. Sorry to step on you there. Because the tool obviously can within not certainly minutes, but once the data is organized within the tool, it can effectuate the decisions. So it can quarantine, delete, move, migrate, all sorts of wonderful things. But the human process of who's making that decision it's got to be pretty complex, as you noted, and bringing that coalition together, I think, is really interesting. So it becomes sort of we can do this, but what should we do in terms of remediation? And particularly, I'm imagining for a company that hadn't figured this out ahead of time, figuring it out in crisis mode, I'm sure led to a lot of late nights and gray hairs and other stress for the organization. And I think this was I'm going to quote you, which is always awkward because you're right here, but I think previously you'd mentioned it's time to fix your roof when the sun is out, right, versus raining. And think about, you're closer to this than I was, but all the pressure that people are under to try to get these things done under the microscope of lots of folks.
Yeah. No, I am a big believer in that. I know it may be more easily said than done, but in the midst of a crisis, it becomes, while you have the rallying cry and the call to action, the burning platform, that's a good thing. It does create a lot of stress and challenges, and that wears on the organization. It wears on your people, wears on on your ability to deliver, so on and so forth. Dean, at the risk of moderating, there's an interesting question from the team here about searching for PII and how you minimize false positives. Do you mind if we take that question real quick? Because it feels probably pretty relevant.
Could I possibly say no? Go ahead.
Well, so thank you for that question. I think I'll start, and Joe and Dean, you can throw in your perspectives here. When we think about doing this data estate scanning and discovery, certainly looking for sensitive data has the potential to create false positives, especially when it comes to PII. How do you disambiguate, for instance, a date of a memo versus a date like a birth date? That can be challenging, and so there's going to be limitations of at some level of your regular expressions, your Boolean logic, etc. And so it comes down to bringing a couple of data points, multiple data points to play to make a decision. So you'd have the data that Active Nav is going to be telling you not only what's potentially in the file, but the context around that file, location, age, date, etc. So you have that as one or more data points, and then it becomes a question of, okay, can I take that data and correlate it with other knowledge of the environment? Do I understand from an Active Directory perspective permissions in a given area? Do I understand from the anchor text of the file location if it would be relevant to a given function or business process? Do I understand where that data is being stored and maintained, through my IT asset management landscape, where who the owner or what function predominantly that data resides back to. And so it's kind of bringing these multiple data points together to really affect true understanding of sensitive data, kind of, take away the false positives. Needless to say, I think we would all appreciate that, tooling like this, any tooling for that matter, from a search and retrieval perspective, is going to create some level of false positive return. It just becomes a question of how do you create these filters and these additional data points to build the necessary context and aboutness that would allow you to make more concrete decisions and sort of reduce that false positive perspective. Joe, do you have anything else you'd add there?
You hit it on the head, really. I think you're going to find false positives. I think that the question is, how easily can you update the logic that you're using when conducting scanning activities to set those aside and weed them out as quickly as possible? I think, to your point, we always find, you're going to find dummy data, all of which can be programmed out with additional logic. But it's important to have some contextual awareness on where you're seeing these targets. And back to your IT asset management point, just because it sits in a test environment doesn't necessarily mean it's test data. And in fact, we've found to the contrary. Oftentimes, there's real data in test environments, which brings about a whole nother set of challenges. And so, I think that, again, it's all about how quickly can you make the necessary adjustments to your code. And obviously, looking at the volumes of data for this particular project, we've had a lot of churn time with scanning activities to be able to continue and to improve the rules as we go along to reduce those false positives. Some things are easier than others. Some things are more, it's easier to modify your patterns for a social security number than it is for a password, right? Because passwords don't really have any defined parameters around them. And so those are always a bit more difficult than some of the more structured fields.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna have to take back moderation duties now. Thank you, Josh. But no, it was a good digression. And I guess one of the things that to me highlighted in here is that organizations are going to have sensitive or toxic data just because of how they do business. And so this task of finding, sensitive information that the company's holding properly is a bit challenging. And I think, Joe, we talked about this when we did this live, was that there was a lot of transitory copies, right? We talk about rot, redundant, obsolete, trivial, but transitory can be a culprit in here as well, which is, it's not that the data was bad and the company shouldn't have it. It was meant to go from one place to another and kind of got stuck in limbo. Maybe talk to that for a second before we move on and start to close out.
Yeah, sure. I think it kind of goes well with, I see the question in here from Bill around having data on endpoints and laptops and having it centralized, and can it be better to manage it centrally? I think the answer is certainly. Oftentimes we see these shadow copies of data reside on local desktop devices as well as on network shares that are headed towards some kind of an authoritative source, some kind of an enterprise data repository, but are left around for the sake of convenience, for the sake of having a backup or a placeholder to revert back to if you need to see what you last loaded. Definitely a big challenge for companies that specialize in any kind of data service or data analytics activities. And I think that locking those areas down and putting some rigorous policy in place around expectations on how those load files and copies are addressed is critical. When I think about the desktop question, there's so many new platforms that are cropping up everywhere for end users to store their files. It's become too easy now to give them a centralized network, either on-prem or off-prem repository, and that certainly promotes better, easier ways to conduct scanning and sensitive content identification. And the same way goes, with file shares inside the network. Some of these locations simply need to be locked down to prohibit the storing of these types of files. And then if they've got to exist, make sure that the policy backs up some type of encryption methodology so that they're at least protected while they're at rest.
Okay, well, thanks, Joe. Let's sprint to the finish here. So obviously we're talking about a burning platform. In this scenario, it was very real and hair on fire scenario. But how do you find a burning platform when you don't have that? Anything you'd sort of highlight here? We've got a lot of bullets we don't need to read through, but how do you guys help clients that aren't seeing all the headlines and aren't feeling this already to kind of have the religious conversion moment?
I think the one that you touched on, Dean, earlier, we haven't gone too deep into it, is the litigation aspect of this. It's real. The costs are real. Paying attorneys to review documents is an extremely costly line item for a lot of legal teams out there. To Josh's point, we have better numbers around costs on data breaches than we've ever had before. You've also got the same hard, crunchy numbers in this e-discovery and litigation space. I think you have to use those. You have to be able to show what the types of risks that the organization is faced with by not introducing some of the governance and management capabilities that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, I would totally agree with Joe on that point. I'd also add that, fortunately or unfortunately, privacy has become, a big driver for implementation of these tools. In the U.S., CCPA obviously is front and center here. It becomes potentially the lowest common or the highest common denominator, however you want to put it, in terms of needing to understand the PII landscape, so to speak, in the U.S. And so, how do you use that as your jumping off point? Suffice to say, I think from a classic sort of information governance perspective, one thing to consider is that you're going to have multiple drivers, or maybe better said, there will be multiple stakeholders that will have similar requirements, cyber, legal, information governance, so on. How do you pull that story together so that the organization can see that if they solve once, or if they buy once, they solve for many. If they invest once, they solve for many. And I've seen where building that story of sort of that common dependency within an organization or common requirement that can also help help drive action. One thing we have highlighted here is cost savings and reduced complexity. I would say reduced complexity would drive the cost savings. At least from my perspective, taking a data estate approach in terms of trying to reduce storage consumption and using storage consumption reduction as sort of a savings ROI has become less prevalent for a number of reasons. And so driving your sort of cost saving story would probably be better aligned to how does it make my ability to adopt future state solutions like cloud-based technologies more streamlined and efficient? How does it reduce my application portfolio because I'm centralizing or coordinating the number of locations that I'm storing? Overhead and operational requirements like that may be a bit on the sort of soft cost savings side, but I think less likely to be challenged, in my opinion, given that the storage side of things could be a tough hill to climb, so to speak.
Yeah, we see that all the time. That's a bit of a legacy from when storage was more expensive days. It's still important, I think, for some organizations, and certainly when you think about the all-in costs of securing and protecting the information, not just the storage costs. But let's jam through the last couple. I think these will go pretty quick. We talk about file analysis as a category, but I think for me it really is this. The underpinning is discovering what's going on in your unstructured data, mapping out that data estate, and thereafter really opens up the potential for your organization to do lots of things. You can clean things up, you can tag, organize, classify, migrate, deal with sensitivity and the rest. And that's really, you can't protect what you don't understand. And I think that's what we're saying universally is there's lots of good stuff to do once you have an understanding of your data estate, but until you get there, it makes the rest pretty hard. And I think, Josh, you were talking about interviews before. We've certainly got some folks on the consulting side who love the interview method of custodians and for legal holds and other things that can be important, but it does it does buttress the need to sort of back up interviews with where the data really sits, and do custodians remember? Are they motivated to remember? Do they care? Do they know? And those sorts of things. So we think it's a nice 1-2 punch when you can take real data insights and combine it with custodial information.
Totally agree.
And I think here, really kind of one of our our last slides before we get to takeaways is the challenge is really in unstructured data. Structured data is not easy, but there's a lot more tools. And so in unstructured data, it's dark, you don't have the visibility. And as Joe talked a little bit about, you've got that sort of transitory data that might be living out there, convenience copies and the like, where it's on the way to becoming structured, but never quite got deleted in its unstructured form. And then just the last few minutes left. What do you guys think? We've got a bunch of takeaways. Obviously, one is to try to find a burning platform before things are actually on fire. What else would you leave the audience with?
I would say, don't fixate on all the dependencies that you might have to get the organization aligned behind implementing a technology. I mean, obviously there's in any organization a need to align stakeholders, et cetera. I think by bringing them into the conversation around, the understanding of the data estate, the importance, and kind of taking the bite-size steps to bring this requirement into the conversation is very important. Start it now. Don't wait. Don't let a good crisis go to waste, but don't wait for the crisis either. I think those are the things that kind of come to mind in my opinion. And chances are there's pockets of work already being done, especially with some of the larger organizations. How can you piggyback off of that?
Yeah, and I would completely agree. I think my focus in IG has always been to try to start small and gain some quick wins. And you have to do that, especially with this particular topic. You've got some idea of if you had the active nav solution today in your network, you probably know the top 5 locations that you would go ahead and and direct it to. And so much like in other cases of IG, where whether you're defining your data estate or ownership issues and addressing those or addressing retention, focus on those crown jewels. Understand, do you even know what they are for your organization? Because you really have to start there, and that can become the cornerstone use case for then expanding upon your governance program. You start small, start where the smoke is, and get some quick wins, and then continue moving it forward from there. Because like we said, it's not impossible to move these things forward without a crisis, right? But it certainly helps if you can show some quick wins right out of the gate, and it helps with overall buy-in to the program and what you're wanting to accomplish as well.
Yeah, and Joe, we see that practically. We work with a lot of customers that either want to do a POC on a server set of data, on a business unit, maybe do a pilot. It's very easy to pick off a chunk of the organization and start getting some real results and build kind of that muscle memory, because we talked about remediation earlier. Nobody, at any size is going to typically roll out a global, all use cases, all data at once. It's just it's too difficult. And even the Fortune 500s that are customers of ours, they'll look at North America, they'll look at a business unit, they'll start, and then they build that muscle memory, they get the wins, they hone the tool, right? That becomes another thing where we talked about false positives earlier. Honing the tool and getting it contoured to your company's unique data set is important, and then they're off to the races and they can start deploying that hygiene. So we've got I don't even know if we have a minute left. Neve, can we squeeze one question in, maybe, Neve?
Yep, I think we have time just for one question, and that is, how do we complete a thorough inventory of my company's information and its life cycle?
Well, I'll start. I would say we've talked a lot about unstructured data. I think if you were to work with a Josh or Joe, they're going to help you think about the totality of your organization's information landscape. We've talked about data estates, and then there's a combination of, there's lots of good tools out there, and but you have to have somebody, in my mind, help run that process, because you're not going to do it without a lens that you're starting the exercise on. I don't know. Hopefully you guys agree to that you want to have a use case kind of drive the.
Yeah, I agree. I would say
exercise.
I'm a big fan of encouraging an organization to have a mandate around building that estate. And what I mean by mandate is what's the outcome you're trying to create. In the case of CCPA, having a data estate that explains your personal information landscape, especially for that regulation, could be a good starting point. How you've achieved that, you sort of build from there. So think about what that mandate or that call to action is proactively, and use that as a milestone or a goal.
Yeah, and then if all else fails, revert back to your BCP, your business continuity plan, if you have one. A lot of times organizations don't look at that enough when thinking about data estate mapping activities. But if you've already got the top 10 lists, critical applications that your company has documented, then start there. It makes the most sense. So.
Great. Thanks, guys. I think we just hit the wire here. Joe and Josh, really appreciate your time. Appreciate the audience for listening in today, and hope everyone found it valuable. And we'll see you on another webinar.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.